Hey friends, welcome to Sabbath School Daily, where we have been studying from the lesson, God's Mission, My Mission. This week we're studying from lesson number 1, which has the title, God's Mission to Us, and today is Sunday's lesson, which has the title, The God Who Reaches Out to Us. Friends, when God created humans, He endowed them with one inalienable right, which is the right to choose. We call it free will. What that means is that God allowed humans to choose for themselves what they would do, if they would go God's way, or they would go their own way. That is at the very core of who God is. Because if God is love, and love, it demands freedom, then God, He offers freedom because of who He is, because of His own very nature. And so when God provided freedom to human beings, that means that He was putting Himself at risk. We find that Jesus is the Lamb that was slain since the foundation of the world. And what that means is that from the very beginning, God knew that things would go down the way that they went. And so in the garden, in Genesis chapter 3, you find that that is where this happens, where you have Satan, the serpent of old, and he dresses himself up. He puts on the appearance of a serpent, and he uses that to deceive the woman. And that happens here in Genesis chapter 3 from verse 1 onwards. And this is what it says. I'm just going to read a few of the verses. It says, "Now the serpent was more cunning than any beast of the field which the Lord God had made. And he said to the woman, Has God indeed said, You shall not eat of every tree of the garden? And the woman said to the serpent, We may eat of the fruit of the trees of the garden, but of the fruit of the tree which is in the midst of the garden, God has said, You shall not eat it, nor shall you touch it, lest you die. Then the serpent said to the woman, You will not surely die. For God knows that in the day that you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." And so, verse 6, when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, that it was pleasant to the eyes, and a tree desirable to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate. She also gave to her husband with her, and he ate. Friends, there is so much information packed into these few verses. First of all, you see that here in verse 1, the Bible tells us that this serpent was the most cunning of the creatures that God had created. Why is that important? Why is the Bible mentioning that? Because you see that later on in verse 6, where we see that the woman, she saw that the tree was good for food, and it was pleasant to the eyes, and a tree desirable to make one wise. What's the thought process? What's the implication here? Well, the implication is that this animal that was seen as the cleverest, the most intelligent, but still an animal, it did not have the capacity of speaking, of reasoning. And this animal, who had presumably eaten of the tree, could now reason as a human. Then it must be true that she, who is human, who was endowed with reason, with sentience, she would then become like God. And so that goes into the argument that the serpent is making. If I eat of the fruit, well, then imagine what's going to happen to you when you eat of it. I can now think like a human. I can speak. Imagine you will be like God. So usually when I read this verse, when I talk about it in my Bible studies, I usually present it in the way where, have you ever watched one of those ads on TV where it's some, miracle medicine, and it's a beautiful song, and it's people walking in the park and they're laughing and playing, and the soothing voice is explaining all the benefits of that medicine. But then in the little letters on the bottom of the screen, you'll see that it has all sorts of bad outcomes or possible side effects. Coma, headaches, blindness, and death. And that's what I see the enemy doing here. The enemy was the first great marketer, right? He made this offer to the woman where he makes it all about being like God. He wanted her to think that she would then be like God. Now, was he lying? Well, yes and no. Because did she become like God? No, she didn't become like God, but she did become like God in knowing good and evil. This is where I see his false representation of what he's saying, because he tells her, you will be like God, and then in the little letters, knowing good and evil. That's how I see it. Of course, it's not like that here, but this is how I understand the narrative of the story, where he's promising her this reality where she's going to be like God, and he makes it seem as though God is holding out on her, out on Adam. And Eve, in this instance, she commits the same sin that the devil himself committed in wanting to be like God. Just read up on Isaiah chapter 14 later on, and you'll see what I'm talking about, where he says that he wants to be like the Most High. He wants to sit on the throne of the Almighty on the farthest reaches of the north. And so this is what Eve wants here. She wants to be like God. But sadly, what the first couple does get instead is the reality of good and evil, of good and bad. And friends, there's a big difference between deciding between good and bad and choosing what is good and what is bad. We don't have that power. That is something that only God can do. It's a divine attribute to morally determine what is good and right. We can choose to steal or not to steal. We can choose to lie and not to lie. We can choose to kill or not to kill, but we cannot choose that these things are either good or bad, right or wrong. We cannot determine that stealing is good, that lying is good, that killing is good. That is a divine prerogative. And so here, what we see is the devil truly deceiving, but in the very hearts of Adam and of Eve. Adam's sin is a different sin than Eve's, where Eve breaks the first commandment and she creates a false god in herself because she wants to be like God. Adam breaks the second sin, which is you shall not create false gods, other gods, images of gods. Here he places Eve on a pedestal and he doubts that God can save her, that God can redeem her. And so you'll see that because of their differences, because of the different sins, you'll also get different curses later on. But that's not part of our whole study. What we do find here is that this is how Adam and Eve, they fall. This is how sin infects our world, infects the human family, infects our reality every single day. But the story doesn't end there, because what we see here in Genesis chapter 3 is that after he is disobeyed, after Adam and Eve make a decision to stray from what God had told them to be life, God comes and reaches out to them. He doesn't abandon them. He doesn't mock them. He doesn't deride them. God, he deals with the problem of sin with a terrible reality. However, he provides an escape. He provides redemption. He seeks them out. In Genesis chapter 3, verse 9, it says, "Then the Lord God called to Adam and said to him, 'Where are you?'" Why did God ask that question? Didn't he already know? Of course he did. Has anyone watching here who is a parent ever caught their child doing something wrong and said, "What are you doing?" Although you know what they're doing. I've never done that because I'm not a parent, but as a child, I had my parents doing that to me. They would come and I would be doing something that I shouldn't be doing, and then they would say, "Luccas, what are you doing?" Now, they already knew what I was doing, but they were giving me the ability, they were giving me the opportunity to come clean. And this is where God gives Adam and Eve an opportunity to come clean. But unfortunately, they don't even take that opportunity seriously. They react in the worst way possible. Adam answers God saying, so he said, "I heard your voice in the garden and I was afraid because I was naked and I hid myself." And he said, "Who told you that you were naked? Have you eaten from the tree of which I commanded you that you should not eat?" Friends, this is a question coming from a broken heart. God here knows what's going on. He knows what's happened, but he continues giving them opportunities to come clean. However, the man says in verse 12, "The woman whom you gave to me, she gave me of the tree and I ate." Do you see who he's blaming? Now, some would say that Adam is blaming his wife. And unfortunately, many husbands blame their wives of things that they are at fault for. Here, that's not the case. Because ultimately, Adam is not blaming primarily his wife. Adam is blaming God. "This woman whom you gave me of the fruit and I ate." No accountability. It's all God's fault. God is the one who gave him this woman. And then God turns to the woman and asks her a similar question. In verse 13, "What is this that you have done?" And the woman said, "The serpent deceived me and I ate." Again, no accountability. Here, when we look at the verse, we see that she is also blaming God, because who created the serpent? Who placed him in the garden? The implication here is clear. God is the one at fault. Humans have been trying to escape accountability since the very beginning, friends. It was like that then, and it's the same now. The truth is that we are accountable. It was their decision. They had the freedom to choose, and they chose. But again, the story doesn't end there, because God provides a way out. In Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, we find the first promise of the entire Bible that says, "And I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel." Here, God is promising that one day someone would come that would get things right. And that, friends, is the God that reaches out to us. That's the God who wants to communicate, who wants to demonstrate that he has not abandoned us. This week, we're going to be talking about that God. Don't miss out on the lesson. It will be a deep one. Please study it. Please comment down below if you have any questions, any comments. I'd love to hear from you. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe to our videos because we release one every day. And I hope to see you again here tomorrow for another Sabbath School Daily.